On August 1st, 2016, a teaser was released that changed Pokemon forever. A change that imbued a breath of new life into commonly overlooked Pokemon and fan favorites alike. Looking back and understanding just how big of an impact regional variants have had on the franchise, it's shocking how casually they were revealed. They tucked it into the first minute of a larger presentation with pretty little fanfare given the gravity of the announcement. Alolan Exeggutor was the perfect choice to open with. The normal one is great, but it definitely flew under the radar over the years. A lot of Kanto's Pokédex seem lackluster when compared to modern Pokemon due to the evolution of the overall design philosophy, especially in regards to typing. Pokemon like Golem, Sandslash, and Marowak are cool, but their typings are pretty bland. This causes them to get passed up by newer players without as much of a Kanto bias who might want that slot to go to something with more interesting coverage. The Alolan Raticate line is a good example. Dark Normal is such a weird and unique combo. Does it have a ×4 weakness to fighting? Yes, but I don't care. So does the Alolan Sandshrew line, in addition to their ×4 weakness to fire. Beauty is pain sometimes. Donphan in the room. They did only give Alolan forms to Kanto Pokemon. What could be seen as pandering with the original 151 could be more charitably viewed as testing the waters of this radically new concept with their most recognizable Pokemon. I do think as the games went on, the overrepresentation of the original 151 in regional form starts to become more apparent, but it gets a lot better before it gets worse. I don't think it's a controversial opinion to say Sword and Shield handled regional forms the best. They had tested the waters in the last generation, saw everyone loved it, so naturally they expanded on the concept in a lot of very fun ways. First and foremost, cross-region variant evolutions. So fucking cool. Let's start with Farfetch'd, a Pokemon that was bland by Gen 1 standards. Normal flying, bad stats, and unless you understand the Japanese saying it's based on, it does nothing for most people. It's the first Gagmon who paved the way for future Jokemon, but even if you like Farfetch'd, are you really gonna use one? That's where Galarian Farfetch'd comes in. A physical representation of you versus the guy she tells you not to worry about. But they didn't just stop there. They turned it into a knight. I absolutely love that they kept Sirfetch'd the same height and almost exactly the same physically, only changing its color and demeanor. This line is the pinnacle of a regional variant's potential. Taking a gag Pokemon people commonly passed over, making it awesome, then one-upping it. All this without parting from the core design that much. Not that drastic changes are a bad thing. Some of the best variant evolutions fall in that category. The second way Sword and Shield expanded on regional variants was by giving new forms to Pokemon outside of Kanto. Corsola also got the Farfetch'd treatment. Its typing isn't even boring. It's a pretty unique combo you don't see very often, and it's very cute. But it still suffers from the, is this worth taking up a slot? Complex. That's where Galarian Corsola and Cursola come in. When our fantasy escapism forces us to reckon with humans' irreparable impact on the environment. I mean, we don't have to. So let's talk about raccoons. The Galarian Zigzagoon line being dark normal might have made you think, oh yeah, Game Freak has started a roding trend. I sure did at the time, but we exist in present day, and we know that isn't the case. What I really find bizarre about this line is how they're the only regional forms to come out of Hoenn to date. This is a potential gold mine of awesome variants. Maybe it's a testament to how solid Gen 3's roster is, so Game Freak doesn't want to tamper with them too much. But I don't know, man, I don't think people would mind if they revisited some of these. They almost gave us some back in Sun and Moon. One for the Whelmer line and another for Salamances. These were going to be extinct evolutionary offshoots that we revived from fossils rather than living cases of divergent evolution, which most likely got scrapped out of fear of redundancy. Whelmers did eventually get recycled into Satitan and Citadel though. The Salamence offshoot was described as a subspecies that retained armor similar to Shelgon's, losing the ability to fly for increased defenses. I'm hoping they reuse this idea somehow because it sounds awesome, but I don't know, chat, I'm not feeling too good about it, especially after we got Roaring Moon, which kind of treads on the same ground. Let me see some F's in the chat for the Salamence tank. I love Galarian Darumaka. I think it's simple and cute, but I do not care for Galarian Darmanitan. I get it, it's supposed to be a snowman with a beard, but it looks like someone with botched lip filler and a protruding brain tumor. Galarian Wheezing is how you handle facial hair. And on that note, there is a Galarian Caparaja in the room. Half of all Galar's regional variants are from Kanto, but none of it felt gratuitous. Even going into the DLC, when every regional form was from Kanto or an offshoot of a Kanto line, I never found myself feeling like there was an overrepresentation because every single Gen 8 variant justified their existence, either by further fleshing out older lines, giving them more unique typings, or replacing existing evolutions with even better ones. If Galar had a problem with Kanto pandering, it was felt in the Gigantamax forms, being the only generation represented in the Gimmick outside of Galar, with the exception of Garbodor, which, good for him. Legends Arceus took full advantage of its premise by making all the new Pokemon almost exclusively regional variants, cross-region evolutions, or both. I called Galar the pinnacle of regional variants, not to put down Hisui. It was just able to do more by virtue of being a new generation with DLC. A lot was going on, but that could also be said for Legends Arceus. The coolest new spin on regional forms was, of course, the starter variants. Emo Typhlosion ushered in the year of the Ghost Fire type. Hisui and Decidueye is just insane. Hisui and Samurott is the only one I've found to be kinda meh. I didn't think too much into it at the time because I was pretty sure it was just recency bias, but with almost 4 years in between its reveal and now, I could say it's the blue color. It's the same shade of blue as normal Samurott. I think if they just lowered the saturation of the blue used on the body, it would both distinguish it from the original and complement its new water dark typing. Hisui also gave us the first pseudo-legendary variant. Hisui and Gudra is a pretty weird case because instead of being primary dragon, it's primary steel secondary dragon. Potentially a nod to Dialga's typing, but in my heart, it's really a nod to the Salamence tank. I find it interesting because it's the only case of a pseudo-legendary not having a primary dragon typing since Hydreigon. And on the topic of Gen 5, I made it clear some of my favorite regional variants are those that breathe new life into commonly overlooked Pokemon, turning duds into viable team members from both an aesthetic and a utility standpoint. And Hisui graced one of the most hated Pokemon in history with a new form and a cross-region evolution. This is a case like Surfetch'd where I can't even comprehend how the designer thought of this and pulled it off to such a brilliant extent. Basculegion is one of the coolest ghost types of all time, and Basculin wasn't the only hated fish to be blessed by Hisui. I always found Quillfish charming, but it's undeniably underwhelming and hard to justify taking up a slot over other Pokemon that could fill its niche better. Quillfish took that negative sentiment to heart and went through a hardcore phase, adopting a very cool typing that negates its psychic weakness, and being the third case of a non-water line gaining access to Swift Swim, which is always fun. Overquill is such a masterful execution of fusing a funny idea with a cool one to create an evolution that makes you forget there was a time before it existed. That's when regional variants and their evolutions execute on the concept the best. There are some regional forms that I don't necessarily hate, but I could take them or leave them. Then there are the ones that are such upgrades that it practically ruins the original for you because you're constantly comparing them in your head with the newer one always coming out on top. The feeling is similar to when you get a pet for the first time and find it hard to believe there was a point in your life when this creature wasn't a character in your world. They take up so much mental real estate that their progenitors have been evicted from your subconscious. Regional variants were one of the greatest things to ever happen to Pokemon, and for a time it looked like things were only going to get better with each generation. But we exist in current day, meaning we know what comes next. Remember how I kept mentioning the overrepresentation of Kanto? That's a little trick of the craft called foreshadowing. Galar's regional forms were 50% Kanto, but there were over 20 of them, so it balanced out. Paldea had 2 lines of regional variants, one being from Kanto. But there was also the new addition of convergent evolutions, you know where this is going. They're all also from Kanto. Now here's the thing, I don't have an issue with either of these lines, and we even got Poltergeist and Sinistra in the DLC. My problem is with how few convergent and regional lines we got, but I want to put a pin in that to talk about Paldea and Tauros because I do have an issue with it. I kinda hate it. I love Jimmy Turner, who was clearly getting experimental with his Gen 9 Pokemon, and Paldea and Tauros was certainly unique, but I just wish it was a split evolution line, with these two being their own Pokemon with some further visual distinction from the original, instead of how they handled it in the games. Also, their shinies are god-awful. This is super subjective though, so I'll move on and pull that earlier pin out to get into my main problem with how Gen 9 handled regional forms. Alola had 18 regional variants. Galar had 25 including variant evolutions. Hisui had 19 including variant evolutions. Paldea had 5. 11 if you count convergent evolutions, which I do, but still. This is a bizarre drop-off. It's not as if Game Freak suddenly found a sense of pride. They announced ZA's DLC a month before the game even came out, and they obviously love revisiting older Pokemon. I love it too. It's a very symbiotic form of fan service, which makes it strange they took their foot off the gas for Gen 9. It's certainly a paradox, isn't it? There's no official source for this, so let's just say it came to me in a dream. That significant drop-off has to do with the 20 Paradox forms given to older Pokemon, further backed up by the legendary Paradox Pokemon being incorporated in the DLC, similar to how the Galarian birds were implemented into Galar's expansion. Paradox Pokemon, specifically the future forms, are a very controversial part of Gen 9 due to the jarring design philosophies, but that's not what I want to talk about in this video. I want to have a more meta discussion about how they were implemented in the games and how they did not justify replacing regional variants. It's fair to say Game Freak might have found it to be redundant if they had as many regional forms as Gen 8, plus the same amount of Paradox Pokemon, which I can understand, but something that really irks me is how you could only catch the Paradox Pokemon after beating AI Sada or Turo. You've already beaten all the gyms and taken down the final boss. Your journey is over by that point, and the journey is when you're wanting to use these Pokemon the most. I really hate that it was handled like this, presumably to make those boss fights more surprising. In Paldean lore, reports of Paradox Pokemon escaping Area 0 have been floating around for centuries prior to our journey, but the only ones we see during the story are the Paradox Donphans, one of the lackluster Titan boss fights. It would have been much better from a design standpoint to trickle out some Paradox Pokemon earlier on, building up to that final expedition into Area 0, then save the major ones like Roaring Moon and Iron Valiant for when you beat the game to make them a more special reward. Another annoying problem is how they're version exclusives. It's a dated mechanic, but usually only a handful of new Pokemon per generation are restricted, so it's usually whatever. But there are 20 Paradox Pokemon. That makes almost 20% of the new Pokemon introduced in the 9th generation version exclusives. Since they were introduced, regional variants typically made up some of the Pokemon exclusive to one game or the other, but it was usually just 1 or 2 lines. That is way different. And again, they're locked to the post-game. To me, it felt like Game Freak artificially extending the amount of stuff you could do after beating the game, and the result was the limitation of an established, beloved category of Pokemon. I'm curious how Paradox Pokemon will be incorporated in future games. Regional variants have been brought back through NPC trades and unique environments, so I wonder if they'll do something similar in the 10th generation, maybe with a mechanic similar to the time-space rifts. I avoided commenting on the Paradox Pokemon from a design standpoint because I just did a video going into detail on how big of a disappointment the Paradox Swords of Justice were, so check that out if you want.